Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Krupinski. I'm the marketing director at Michigan Radio. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for our Issues in Ale discussion. Issues in Ale is an event series sponsored by Michigan Radio designed to engage people in conversations about important issues going on in Michigan. And let me stop my screen sharing so you can actually see me. There I am. Sorry about that. As I said, Issues in Ale is an event series designed to engage people in conversations about important issues going on in Michigan. Now, in pre-COVID days, we would be gathered at a local brew pub or beer tavern somewhere in Michigan, but obviously, like everyone else, we're doing things virtually via Zoom. So we thank you for joining us, and we invite you to sit back with a beer or the beverage of your choice and enjoy our discussion this evening. Before we get started, I do want to let you know about one other upcoming event. Our next Issues in Ale at Home will be taking place on Thursday, April 22nd. That's 2 weeks from tomorrow, and it's Earth Day. Lester Graham of the Environment Report will be hosting a special Earth Day discussion on the impact of climate change in the Great Lakes region. We hope you'll join us for that event. You can register to attend on the events page at michiganradio.org, and we will also be sharing the link for that registration page in the chat box. So we are recording tonight's event, and I also want to let you know that the audience will be muted throughout the event, but we will be taking your questions. We had quite a few that were submitted in advance, but if you have a question at any time, please submit those using the Q&A box. You may also see a chat box on your screen, but we are going to ask you to use the Q&A box to submit your question, and we will try to answer as many of those as we can. So our host tonight is Zoe Clark. Zoe is Michigan Radio's program director and our resident political junkie. You can often hear her giving her political analysis on Michigan Radio's Stateside show. So here is Zoe Clark.
Hi, everyone. I wish I could say it's so good to see all of you, but I will feel you out there in spirit, hopefully everyone with their beverage of choice, because I found out just today that it is National Beer Day or International Beer Day or Michigan Beer Day. It is some kind of day with beer, and so this is perfect that we are doing Issues in Ale for this. I want to go ahead and unmute our very esteemed guests who are joining us tonight, and I couldn't be more thrilled to introduce Ted Goodman, who is the new communications director for the Michigan GOP. Ted, welcome back to Michigan. You are originally from the UP, left, and you are now back.
That's correct. Thank you, Zoe. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with you.
Yeah, and we should note, so you are working for the new chair of the Michigan Republican Party, Ron Weiser, co-chair Meshawn Maddock, and you worked on President Donald Trump's second impeachment trial doing communications. So welcome.
That's correct. It was part of the 2020 campaign as well.
Yeah, I want to welcome Jeff Timmer, who is the former state executive director of the Michigan Republican Party. So Ted and Jeff never overlapped within the party. Jeff, you also were a senior advisor to the Lincoln Project, a super PAC that was working against Donald Trump in his re-election. So awesome to have you here. Thanks for making the time.
For having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and finally, we have the one and only Emily Lawler. Emily is a Capitol reporter for MLive. If you don't wake up to and just look for her byline every single morning, you are doing something wrong in your life. Emily is a longtime member of Michigan's Capitol Press Corps, has covered many elections in Michigan, so we're super lucky to have her tonight too. And you were already with the governor today, Emily, so you are making the rounds.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So I was going to start off by saying, like, can we set some ground rules about what tonight is about? There was a lot of interest when we came up with this topic. We actually decided to do this back at the end of January, if I'm remembering correctly, and it was right after Biden had been sworn into the presidency, after the insurrection, after the second impeachment trial, and we were sort of wondering, you know, what is next for the Republican Party? And it feels like that question, especially with Ron Weiser at the head of the Michigan Republican Party, which Ted, of course, we will talk about, has been making news. And so it still feels very relevant for this evening. Jeff, I want to start with you. I'm going to guess mostly just that you have been the longest member of the Republican Party out of anyone on this panel, I think it's fair to say.
You're
Jeff
saying
Timmer,
I'm a little older than Ted?
maybe slightly. When I ask what is the future of the Republican Party, like it feels a little cliche and this big amorphous question, but to you, as a former, party official who now has sort of sworn off Donald Trump, what is the future of your Republican Party?
Well, unless things change from my perspective, I think the future looks a lot like it did for the dinosaurs after the asteroid hit. I don't see much of one as the party becomes older and whiter and smaller. And so I just don't see that, when you look at where the Republican Party was just 4 years ago when Trump got elected, look at where it was in Michigan with the Republicans holding all of the statewide offices, super majorities in the legislature and congressional delegation, and hundreds more county and local offices than they hold today. Nearly all of that is gone, not just in Michigan, but across the country. And the trend isn't changing anytime soon.
Ted, to you next. What is the future of your Republican Party?
Never mind my Republican Party. Let's talk about the future of the Republican Party. As Jeff said, let's look back at 2016. Let's look at here in Michigan. President Trump won the state. He won the state by bringing out new voters, folks that frankly, a lot of them had never voted before or hadn't voted in years, Republican or Democrat. He won over a lot of Democrat votes in Macomb County, working class votes that for generations did vote Democrat. Ronald Reagan was able to bring them over, and President Trump did as well. And so the future of the Republican Party has never been brighter. It's never been a larger tent with such a diverse group of Americans that will make up what I'm confident will be the biggest and brightest Republican Party that we've ever seen.
Emily, as a reporter, if you hear those two very different opinions about one thing, put your reporter cap and dissect how those two narratives fit together or don't.
Well, they fundamentally don't. So I won't sugarcoat that. But, I think that the dichotomy you're seeing here is sort of who does the Republican Party court in the future. Ted mentioned that they're bringing out these people who have never voted before, certainly. And then Jeff was pointing to the people who, used to identify as Republicans and really don't see that party as the home for their values anymore. So I really think that, the Republican Party has to make a decision about how to broaden its base to move forward.
Look no further than the Gallup poll that was released this morning that shows the largest gap in party identification in more than a decade. Nearly 50% of all Americans identify themselves as Democrats, and only 40% do as Republicans. And that's, the gap hasn't been this wide in a political generation, and it's widening. And it's widening at an accelerated pace since November 3rd, and since all the lies about the election, and since the lethal insurrection on January 6th.
Ted, I want to go to you because obviously this is called the future, not the past of the Republican Party. But you talked a little bit about sort of the ability for Trump to turn out the base in 2016. He did win Michigan by some 11,704 votes, but who's counting? And then ended up losing the state by more than 110,000 votes. What happened in that 4-year period then, if it is still an incredibly strong party and one that Donald Trump, won Michigan, at least we're talking in 2016, but lost in 20. What happened there?
What happened in terms of?
Well,
Look, President Trump won Michigan decisively in 2016. 2020, it was very close again. Of course, Joe Biden, different candidate than Hillary Clinton, someone who was able to successfully paint himself as, a union Democrat, working class Pennsylvania, and he was successful in painting himself as something that he isn't, quite frankly. And so I'll give him some credit for that. But President Trump garnered more votes, the second most votes in American history in this last cycle. And he did that because he had a message that spoke to the American working man and the American working woman. And that's not going anywhere anytime soon. And this isn't just about President Trump. And like you said, this is also about, we're talking about the Republican Party. But President Trump understood, he had a unique understanding of where the American people, how they were feeling about trade deals that did nothing to help working families across the Midwest, about a foreign policy that definitely needed to be revised and that President Trump oversaw. And we could go on, and I know we'll talk more about this. But the Republican Party of today is the party of the working man, the working woman, and it's never been bigger.
Jeff, you were looking like you wanted to jump in.
Oh, I was just I think it's interesting that Ted's trying to differentiate the party from Donald Trump or Donald Trump from the party when the party doesn't even try to do that. And when you talk about the party of the working men and women, let's talk about the millions who were working when Donald Trump was president, who no longer are as he finished his term.
Jeff, obviously we had a global pandemic, which I don't think either of us would lay at the feet of the president, the former president. And so let's talk about what the jobs numbers were in December of 2019.
That sounds before this. And what were they in October of 1929? I mean, you know, when you don't take any steps to mitigate the damage, to prolong and expand the damage and job losses, that's where the criticism comes in. You're right. Nobody could have, no president could have forestalled COVID from coming, to America. But if you randomly picked any one of 330 million other people, they probably would have done a better job.
I'm interested
that's absolutely not true. President Trump's response was immediate, steadfast, and this isn't about defending President Trump. So I'll keep it short. President Trump's response was immediate and effective in minimizing the risk to Americans early on in this pandemic.
500,000 people would disagree.
So Emily, I want you to jump in. You're about to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's really interesting to see this discussion take place here, because I frankly thought that there would be this sort of discussion about whether the Republican Party is going forward the party of Donald Trump or the party of a set of ideals and principles. And I frankly expected that to play out within the party and for there to be like a pretty real reckoning about that. And I haven't seen that. And, I think that it's interesting that you two are having this discussion, but I'm interested in what this discussion looks like inside the party and what it'll eventually look like outside the party.
Emily, there isn't much discussion within the party. President Trump has record approval ratings among Republican Party members. What you see is, a fight among some lobbyists in Lansing and some folks in Washington, D.C. Frankly, there's no, the Republican Party base supports President Trump. And part of it is because he was such a successful president, but it's also because of the way the media and people in Washington treated him. And so they're not necessarily the strongest supporters of President Trump, but they see how unfairly he was treated by the permanent Washington political class. And they said, you know what? This isn't right. And so that also drove a lot of people to support President Trump.
But when you say your base supports him, you're discounting all the people who have left your base because they don't support him.
I'm not discounting it. I'd like to know what number of people. Give me that number. How many people left?
I would assume you have the numbers here, Ted.
Well, it's not about. Well, I'll tell you, they're very small. They're very small. A very small number of individuals left the party, and frankly, a lot of them that left, it was because they, for some unfortunate reason, were influenced by false narratives by the media, by groups like the Lincoln Project, who painted the president as somebody he wasn't. And so even among the folks that did leave the party because of President Trump, they didn't do it because of President Trump. They did it because, unfortunately, they were influenced by a nonstop 24/7 cycle that just beat up on him day in and day out. And I hate to do it, but I got to give Jeff and the Lincoln Project a little bit of credit, not a lot. Look, they failed across the board in the races they played in. But they did, their videos on YouTube had a lot of views and that. So, and they were an example of a lot of different groups that just constantly hammered President Trump. And so a lot of folks some of the folks that left, that's why they left. It wasn't even because of anything President Trump did.
It was.
So I want to just put a book in here. I want to just take a second, and I want to restate a couple facts, which is what we know is absolutely what you said, Ted, that Donald Trump got the second most votes out of any presidential election in U.S. history, second only to Joe Biden, who, of course, got some 7 million more votes nationwide. So this was a huge turnout election.
What was the margin that decided the election? The states, what was the margin? It was something like...
Yeah, it was something like tens of thousands of votes, right?
Small,
like something like that.
Very small.
And that also happened to be pretty close to the case in 2016 as well. That Hillary Clinton ended up, when you actually looked at it, winning 2 million votes more in the popular vote. But when you look at those few states, so
President Trump won Michigan.
Right, by 11,000 votes, and then he lost it by more than 111,000 4 years later. So again, I think what we can all agree on as a basis set of facts is that more people came out to vote, and the top two history vote-getting folks ran in this last historical election. So there is passion, right? I mean, you can feel it in this conversation right now. And I think this is why we're so interested in what the future is of one party in this two-party system. Now, of course, it is not fair to say that the Democrats don't have their own internal struggles. When you have a party that has a Senator Manchin and you have a Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you have very similar, issues. I think what Emily was getting to, though, and this is what I want to come back to after we've put, this in history, is in 2012, there was sort of this infamous report that came out that Republicans did after Mitt Romney lost to then President Barack Obama in 2012. And it basically said, here's what we need to do. Younger voters and sort of the Marco Rubios of the parties came out, right? Well, cut to 4 years later, and that's not who won the primary. Donald Trump did win the Republican primary. And so I think what I want to try to get at is when Emily's talking about what is the Republican Party and who's having these conversations, fundamentally, aren't we talking about two very separate parties that eventually need to come to terms that they can't be under the same tent? And Jeff, you being someone that sort of recently left but wants to come back.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there are millions of voters across the country and hundreds of thousands who have, when you say who's left the party, in states, the 30-some states that do party registration, there are hundreds of thousands fewer Republicans today than there were last year. That's just a fact. But there are people like me who I consider myself a conservative in the term as it would have been applied in 2010 or 2005 or 1995, and I don't consider myself a Democrat right now. I find myself aligning with Democrats is more of a pragmatic save the democracy.
Really? AOC? Rashida Tlaib?
No.
Yeah, you don't align yourself, really?
And I was part of the coalition of the 81 plus million people, that's a coalition that spanned from Bernie Sanders to people like John Kasich and Tom Ridge and Christy Todd Whitman and hundreds of others, former Republican elected office holders and party officials, Michael Steele and Rick Snyder and many others. And so we are political nomads, really. We still believe in the principles that led us to be Republicans, that led us to call ourselves conservative, led to governing majorities that were center-right during most of the last 50 years. And our politics are seriously out of balance right now, as the party has largely abandoned those principles while they had control. You didn't hear Republicans talking about lower spending and tackling the federal deficits and debt while they had control during Trump's first 2 years or during the second 2 years of his presidency. And now that Biden's president, they suddenly find their orthodoxy again on the stimulus package.
Jeff, you would agree that's not a Trump issue. Like, ask Congress why they didn't get anything done the first 2 years of the Trump presidency.
And then you look at a party that had for the first time since 1854, no party platform at their convention. It was whatever Trump wants. When it becomes a cult instead of a party, that's where I have a problem with it.
So Ted, I do want to pick up on something that Jeff said when we are talking about the future, which, as Jeff said, there was a wide coalition of folks who seemed to be just anti-Trump, right? It was not about necessarily
a very small, maybe vocal, but it wasn't a lot of people. It wasn't a lot of people. It was a small number of individuals. Some of them career Republicans. We're with one now, and so it's a very small number is my thing. And we like to talk about it in Lansing. We like to talk about it in Washington. But trust me, back home, my friends aren't talking about who in Lansing is or isn't supporting President Trump. I can tell you that what they heard was a president who told it like it is, and that they knew was going to fight for them. They knew that he was going to go to bat for them. He was willing to go up to Ford Motor executives and tell them, we're going to build cars here. And, if not, we're going to take steps to ensure our workers here in America are paid a fair wage to put these cars together.
Ted, I think that number of people who were voting against Trump and who vehemently opposed Trump is larger than you think. And I just say that because I have been the reporter standing on street corners, talking to strangers. Frankly, those people were not hard to find. Neither were Trump's ardent supporters, certainly. But I will say that even among his ardent supporters, I would find people who basically made all the points you just made about how effective he'd been. And then would say, I really wish he'd lay off Twitter, or I really wish that he'd present differently. So I do think that there's sort of a group of people who may have supported his policies as well, but who are less tied to his personality.
There's a reason why you've seen a county, Ted talked about Macomb County, but there's a reason why Oakland County has shifted so dramatically in its politics. And it's not because everybody who lived there 10 years ago doesn't live there anymore. The most people who are there have changed where they align themselves. They were 10 years ago solid Republicans. Over the course of the last decade, they became political independents. And now most of them, especially the upper education, upper income folks in Oakland County and Kent County, you're seeing a dramatic shift in political alignment and affiliation. You're seeing it certainly at the top of the ticket, and they voted against Trump pointedly. Not because he did mean tweets, because they didn't want him to be president. Some of them then voted for Republicans down ticket. That's why Republicans did better with a higher turnout than some people expected.
So I want to just jump in really quick here because we are, if you can believe it or not, almost halfway into this conversation, and we have not even gotten into the first question from our many panelists who are watching. So thank you for your patience, everyone out there. And I want to say we're hearing from a lot of different folks comments quickly. I am reading a comment from Lena Epstein, who some of you may remember the name, who ran for Congress herself. Hello, who says, Ted, she believes your comments are right on. Also two folks, Peter, who says, I left the party and so did the person who's with him over Trump. So he says, that's two of us, at least, Ted, for a number right there. So let's jump into.
Thank you, Lena. And I just want to say that Lena Epstein is a phenomenal woman.
Yeah, checks in the mail, right? So this is, NPR, maybe NPR, after hours, but it is NPR after all. So let's jump a little bit into policy. And Ted, we've gotten actually quite a few questions sort of this nature. So instead of calling one person out, I'm going to just kind of articulate broadly. And then Jeff, I want you to jump in after Ted, which is that there's this concern among some Republicans, some of whom have even voted for Trump 2 times in a row now, about what the Republican Party actually stands for today. And some folks bringing up Jeff's point about the fact that there wasn't a party platform, right? This last go around, and that it oftentimes seemed like what you were reading on Twitter from Donald Trump, one given to the next, became the party platform. And so the question is, what does the party stand for today, outside of sort of what Trump is? Like, what is the Republican Party if not? Yeah.
Economic opportunity for all Americans. A fair shot at the American dream for all. Empowering communities, empowering families, strong communities. The Republican Party of today stands for putting the American people first, creating opportunities for Americans. This party, look, we have a Democrat Party today that's fighting for what, $15 minimum wage? Why aren't we working and teaching folks how to create a living where they're making $15,000 a day, right? Like we should be. That sounds wonderful. And I want to jump in because I think that is something all of us could agree on, that all four of us on this call and everyone watching should be making that kind of money. But that's my point. Why are we limiting ourselves? Why it's like that?
Do you think the minimum wage should be higher than $15 an hour?
That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is let's create opportunities and ensure every child has a shot at the American dream. And it's not necessarily just about making a lot of money, right? That's one route, but it's about allowing all Americans, all children, to pursue their version of that American dream, whether that's financial success or chasing a pursuit of theirs, a strong interest. And so the Republican Party stands for that and creating an environment that allows jobs to flourish. Parents and children and their families are the ones empowered to make decisions when it comes to their schooling and those sorts of things.
Okay, so a lot of that sounds really good. And I think a lot of folks on the surface would say, well, sure, all of those things sound good. Letting families make decisions for families and economic success, right? It's like a little boilerplate, which is not wrong or anything. But Jeff, when you hear that, that sounds like Republican values. It sounds certainly to me like there's definitely some Democratic values in there too. Where is that disconnect then between the future of the party and why you left versus what Ted is saying?
I mean, those kind of policy talking points are the ones that we as a party, that I helped lead in Michigan, 15 years ago. That's what I believe. That's what we said. A lot of those issues have universal appeal that could appeal beyond partisan Republicans, that could build broad coalitions of support. But that's not where they're fighting today, and that's the frustration. We're glossing over what happened between November 3rd and January 6th and January 20th, and the lethal insurrection that was fueled by the President of the United States and incited by the majority of elected Republicans in Congress. That is a problem. That's where the party is focused. And since then, they're not doing those things that Ted is talking about. What they're doing now in Lansing is preparing to expand the legislature's elected powers with a package of bills that will allow them to step in and subsume local control when they want to in future elections. And that's a problem.
Well, that was an interesting shot at the end on election reform, Jeff. I fundamentally disagree with, when he says they, I'm guessing you're referring to today's Republican Party. What the party's focused on is defeating a governor who's instituted policies that have destroyed small businesses, kept children out of schools, keeping them back from education. We haven't even talked about the unfortunate nursing home situation. Many questions remain unanswered. And we have a governor that's much more focused on growing her national profile and appeasing the permanent Washington political class than doing what's right for Michiganders. And yet with all these draconian measures, we still lead the nation in new COVID-19 cases. So that's what the Republican Party in Michigan's focused on ahead of 2022, is electing leaders that place their trust in the Michigan people and don't rule by fiat in Lansing.
Emily, I want to go to you, who spends most of her waking days in Lansing, much of around the Capitol and these Republican leaders, as well as the Democratic governor. In some respects, is it fair to say, at least if you're looking right now at the national level versus Lansing politics, is it fair to actually say that the Republican Party seems a bit more cohesive here in Michigan than necessarily they do on the national level, and that it's cohesiveness possibly against a Democratic sitting governor?
Yeah, good question. I will say I pay attention to Michigan politics at the peril of paying attention to national politics a lot of the time. So, when I look at the relationships in Lansing, obviously I'm seeing a record level of frost, maybe every 6 months, a new record level of frost between the governor's office and the Republican majority. I think that the Republican majority is certainly trying to assert themselves in a few ways right now. And then I just didn't want to let the comment on nursing home slide. So Ted, I'm sorry. I wrote the sort of definitive story with a colleague of mine, Julie Mack, on that. And, there's basically no reason in Michigan's nursing home numbers, and also like the federal numbers that corroborate Michigan's, to think that we are hiding deaths in the way that New York was. Basically, they were counting people who started at nursing homes and went to hospitals, not as nursing home deaths. That's not the case in Michigan, or at least the data indicates we're actually counting those people. So, Emily,
I didn't necessarily say that, right? I didn't accuse the governor of
No, you guys never, there's never been direct accusations. It's just,
but there are so many unanswered questions when it comes to nursing homes. I can't let that slide either, Emily.
Identified
the nursing home policies that were put in place early, there are a lot of questions over once deaths started to be recorded. I encourage folks to look into that, how daily death tolls are recorded, and how in many of these days they included vital record searches, right? Deaths that occurred during vital record searches. Just look into it. I'm not making any accusations. There's a lot of questions. Of course, we have a prosecutor in Macomb County that's asking a lot of questions in regards to this. So prosecutors are.
I asked Prosecutor Lucido for his best evidence, and he told me he doesn't have best evidence. I truly I don't know what the specifics that you're looking for are. Like data selection.
Lucido's very touchy-feely about this issue.
Look, the prosecutor is asking folks to come forward that unfortunately may have lost loved ones in nursing homes, may have some information that he'd want to review. He's asking to collect this information, and it's just it's something that we need to be looking at. It's a very unfortunate situation. We understand the governor had to make a lot of tough decisions, but we cannot let her off the hook if in fact there's a similar story here that we saw in New York. And just because a member of Governor Whitmer's press office hasn't had a slip of the tongue like somebody from Cuomo's office did, doesn't mean there isn't something here. And so we're asking questions. Let's see what happens in terms of investigation and what some of these prosecutors find. But it's a very serious matter.
Sorry,
Republicans have been investigating this for quite some time, and I truly have not heard anyone point to a there. So I just, when that gets raised as a specter, I sort of question where that's.
It's good to question things. You're a good reporter. You're in Lansing, and we would just encourage you and others to continue to ask the governor questions. And in some cases, we'd like to see some reporters asking more questions. But I'm not questioning your reporting abilities, Emily. You're a very fine reporter. You're a very
so
good reporter.
I'm going to step in here, to say Emily is one of the best reporters in the state of Michigan, and we are all lucky to have her here. I will also say, Ted, that this is something that Republicans, including Pete Lucido, who is now the prosecutor of Macomb County, has been pushing. There hasn't been the
largest county in the state at that. That's important.
Who has been pushing it and yet hasn't been able to show any evidence. Ed McBroom, a state senator on one of the committees himself, said it seems like there absolutely is not a smoking gun, and would love to see folks move forward. And also should note that this was very early legislation, and the laws that right now the state is under are ones that Republicans and Democrats approved together that Whitmer signed. So let's just stick that there to say, read Emily's account of what we know and the data that we know, And my guess is, like you said, that Pete Lucido is going to Pete Lucido, and he will continue to try
I can't let that go, Zoe. Look, read Emily's account, read other stories, look into it, and I'd encourage folks to do just that. Absolutely, I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to some questions from Chris, who says, and I want to throw this one to you, Jeff, although there's not necessarily to whom it wants to fly. How does the Republican Party bridge the gap with fiscal policies and yet outdated social stances that have a minority of support from the American people?
I mean, that's, I think, sums up the conundrum right now of the, trying to rebuild what was the center-right coalition that was so successful over the last several decades. And when you look at, the rise of, I'll just say white nationalism within the party. The people who are spreading the lies about the last election. People like the co-chair of the Michigan Republican Party that are now, rather than, kept away from the stage, are given the microphone in leading positions just because, somebody has conservative fiscal views. They want to control the federal deficit and tackle the national debt. They're not going to be comfortable in a coalition with white nationalist insurrectionists just because they align on fiscal policy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ted, go ahead now. It sounded like you wanted to jump in.
No, I'm doing a good job. We all look. I want to say this. Obviously, the Michigan Republican Party denounces white nationalism and everything it stands for. Full stop. Right? Full stop. Full stop. The co-chair of the Michigan Republican Party, Michonne Maddock, is a mother, a business owner. She's a strong leader. And she is in no way, shape, or form tied to any of these fringe groups. And so I have to say that. And so
we should say that the co-chair was in DC though on January 6th with her husband, who's also a lawmaker here in Michigan.
Millions of people were in DC.
On January 6th.
With COVID and the lockdowns, I'm not sure if the population, if it was over 1 million people that day. My point is hundreds of thousands of people are in DC any given day.
Right, but she was there for Trump's speech that was right before when folks were all walking to the Capitol. She wasn't just there for sightseeing. She was there for the speech.
Okay, so are you but let's not conflate the speech with individuals who may have broke the law and I don't want to go into this, but let's not conflate folks that attended a speech with individuals that broke the law by entering the Capitol building at the time.
Oh, and I'm not trying to conflate that. I'm just saying that I think some of.
We had to say she was in DC on that day, so I know we're not trying to conflate it, but I want to point out she was in DC that day, but she was not a part of any of the
about the election. That's why she was there, to fuel the facade that the election was stolen, to stop the certification. That's why the people were summoned to Washington. I'm not going to let you walk past that like it didn't happen.
Well, let's not. All right. Let's move on. I agree that we should move on.
If you want to talk about the Republicans not cozying up to, okay, you denounce white nationalism. What about Mike Shirkey and the armed extremists? Up in the gallery of the Senate last April, meeting with them afterward to give them PR advice on how to handle it better the next time they're at the Capitol with guns. That's a problem, don't you think?
Sorry, are you asking me a question?
Sounded like it.
That was a lot of stuff, and then you said, "Don't you think?" So it's not fair for me to then.
Well, I was asking, when you say the Republicans Party of Michigan doesn't align themselves with these people, what do you say about Mike?
Of course not. And it's unfortunate. It's not fair, and it actually gives them a larger platform when you have Democrats and these never Trumpers continually to talk about the white nationalist wing and that. Look, we strongly denounce white nationalism. Full stop. We shouldn't have to go any further.
You shouldn't have to go any further, but unfortunately, I think, and I don't think this is trying to skate around an issue, Ted, or by saying that the co-chair of Michigan's Republican Party was in DC on January 6th. I'm not saying that she was at all part of the Capitol riots.
Okay.
What I'm saying is there's some information about, Ted, just a second, that there's some it's okay, that there's some information about where the state of the Republican Party is. And maybe it's not specifically that Meshawn Maddock was storming the Capitol doors. She wasn't. But you have a co-chair of the Republican Party who was at Trump's speech that you then worked basically on a second impeachment over because of this president's activities, right?
Because partisan Democrats fundraising, that's what it was about.
There were seven GOP senators that voted for the impeachment along with that. It was a bipartisan impeachment.
Members of the House?
No, of the Senate. I'm talking about Mitt Romney.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Of course. Okay. So I understand. Look, some folks, I'm not speaking for Meshawn right now, but some folks may have looked at it as, January 6th, the president had, a couple weeks left in office. It was a chance to see him speak. And I just don't want us to, and you made it clear you're not, conflate, being in DC that day with breaking the law, which we all denounce that as well. So with that, I'd love to get back to discussing the future of the Michigan Republican Party and policy and that sort of thing.
Well, then with that note, let's move forward and talk specifically about the Michigan Republican Party and the future, which I'm sorry, I know you're not speaking for her, but Meshawn Maddock is the co-chair of, and then you have Regent and Ambassador Ron Weiser, who is the chair of the party, taking over for Laura Cox earlier this year. And we've gotten quite a few questions about Ron Weiser's statements at a party fundraiser, in which he spoke about some of the female executives of the state, including the Attorney General, the Secretary of
I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off, Zoe. It was not a fundraiser. I have to.
Oh, okay. A party, it was a group of Republicans, and there was no money being fundraised. He was speaking to a group of Republicans. Is that fair?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So it was a small group of Republicans in North Oakland County. Yeah.
Okay. A small group of Republicans, no money being raised. And he called these three women witches. And then he insinuated, joking or not, which seems to be sort of where we're spending all this attention, was he joking or not? But either way, said basically that other than voting Republicans Peter Meyer and Fred Upton out of office to Michigan Republicans, that assassination was the other option. He has repeatedly said he was trying to be funny, that it was tongue in cheek, but enough so that he's since apologized and said that those statements were not okay to be said. So when we talk about the Michigan Republican Party with these two folks as the head, what exactly are we talking about then? When these are the folks who are leading the party and yet wanting to be a bigger tent and bringing people in, is this the way that we should be talking about voters and elected officials?
Look, the chairman came out and said what he said. He apologized. I'll let his statement speak for itself when it comes to that. And in terms of our party ahead of 2022, again, I point to 2016, President Trump. He brought in all these new voters. Moving forward, Governor Whitmer and her failed response to the pandemic. Michiganders are gonna strongly and resoundingly reject the draconian shutdown that, even with everything we've done, the record number of new cases we're seeing. And so this party has never been bigger. We've never had we made big inroads with a lot of groups, by the way, in the 2020 election, including what we refer to as minority populations. By the way, I hate that term, but we did make strong inroads. And in Michigan, ahead of 2022, we're going to have strong candidates who are going to be espousing a message of economic opportunity, putting the Michigan people first, and being responsive to the people of Michigan and not special interests in Lansing and in Washington.
Emily, I want to throw it to you. Go ahead. You go, and then I'll ask the question.
Can we talk about women for a second?
Please.
So I just think that, obviously there's been a lot of press and a lot of discussion about areas like northern Oakland County and areas like Kent County and sort of the suburban woman vote. I remember asking Laura Cox about sort of her strategy for winning some of those suburban women back after the 2016 election 2018 election. And, at the time she had sort of pointed out that she is a suburban white woman. She thinks she has a pretty good line on them. And I think that I obviously was not going to argue with that. But, I'm curious as to what the Republican Party is doing to recruit and retain women, not only as part of that big tent we're talking about, but also as candidates. I mean, it's stuck out to me that, perhaps even more than the numbers in Kent or Oakland counties. If I were Republicans, I would be looking at the number of female candidates they added to the House of Representatives this cycle, which I believe is 0. I'm just thinking that long term, it's not going to behoove the Republican Party to let go of that as sort of a segment of the population.
And name calling a group of women elected leaders probably also isn't helpful for that then too.
And it's a farm team, right? The House of Representatives puts out a lot of great candidates that go on to become statewide candidates. And frankly, the Republicans' statewide candidates who were women performed pretty well in this last cycle. We saw, for instance, the University of Michigan Board of Trustees, the Wayne State Board of Trustees. And, I wonder if as a party, you guys worry about sort of who you're bringing up through the ranks to win those statewide races 10 or 20 years from now.
Sure, we absolutely are, Emily, and that's a great point and question. And look, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the ranks, right? We don't necessarily need just career politicians. They don't have to come from the House and the Senate, right? The State House, State Senate, the business community, folks outside, who knows, right? Sometimes journalists jump in and run for office. So it's not necessarily just elected officials. But as far as resonating with women, they make up half the population. Our message of economic opportunity, to me, it resonates, the same with women as men. And so I would just say that the Republican message of economic opportunity, personal responsibility, strong families, pro-life, this sort of thing resonates with women just as much as it resonates with men.
Jeff?
It should, maybe, in theory, but it hasn't. That's why the number of Republican or the number of women who identify themselves as Republicans has shrunk. It has. That's not a subjective argument I'm making. It's subjective fact. The number of women in the country, the gender gap has never been wider. And there's a reason for that. They're not liking what they're hearing, or they're not liking the way they're hearing it. They're not liking the messengers. And so that's a problem that the party needs to address. It's not just talking points. It's a fundamental issue it's the party's message and messengers have become repellent to women over the last decade, not attractive.
And we should note, though, that there was a large number of women Republicans elected nationwide to the House of Reps, as we were talking about. And in 2018, right, there was sort of the so-called blue wave. And in Michigan, some people were sort of calling it the quote unquote pink wave because of how many women elected. I, for one, am not a huge fan of the color pink anyways. I'm not exactly sure why that became a thing. Emily, what I want to get to you next is, as we're talking about the Republican Party in Michigan, Ted, you were sort of bemoaning the fact of what folks talk about in Lansing and people spending a lot of time, you were saying, in DC and career politicians. But the fact is, a lot of that is what makes politics happen and is a feature of government working. And Emily, sort of one of the stories that I think has started to get some play, but maybe not enormous amounts, is the idea of the business community, right, in Michigan coming forward. You had the Detroit Regional Chamber of Commerce, for example, coming out, Sandy Barua, and saying, we're going to think and reevaluate the endorsements and the money that we give to candidates who talk about their refusal to believe that the election results were valid. Are we starting to see what feels like whether it be the ML, the Major League moving out of Georgia and statements from Coca-Cola? Are we starting to see big business and money start pushing the Republican Party in a direction in a way that business hasn't necessarily in the past decade or so, and kind of coming to the forefront and taking some responsibility?
Yeah, that's something that I'm tracking and interested in as well. You mentioned the example of after the insurrection, businesses making some key decisions in terms of funding. I would point to if you look at, perennial issues in Lansing, I guess the LGBT Civil Rights Initiative has garnered a lot of opposition from Republican lawmakers, but a lot of support from corporations and businesses. And then, of course, you mentioned what we're seeing in Georgia with businesses taking a stand on some of those voting issues there. So I think that certainly they're working to assert themselves. I'm curious as to how much impact that has. Sometimes I think of businesses as sort of blanket donors. I believe that's a term I invented or maybe heard once a million years ago and just use all the time. But there are a lot of businesses who, they might be giving $500 to everybody or, maybe more to the party that's in power, maybe not. So, I'm curious as to how businesses start to kind of wield bigger financial swords. And honestly, I would say their greatest potential for influence is probably more on like the dark money side of things. Obviously, nonprofits, 527s that aren't registered through the state. I think that, that probably has bigger potential than the hard dollar donations. So frankly, I don't think that any of us are really equipped to determine the impact just by looking at what we can look at.
Jeff, I assume this is something that you're spending a lot of time looking at as well, that what is that breaking point, if there is one?
Well, I think that the companies, the leading employers in the country and in Michigan, it's not just money. It's not just what they do with their donation. It's how they set the tone. It's how they play into the public perception. And this isn't just a political issue. This is a cultural issue. And when the Detroit Chamber steps up and says, it doesn't matter necessarily that you answer every question on our questionnaire right. If you signed onto the Texas lawsuit or sent the letter to the congressional or to Congress saying, don't certify Michigan's votes, we're not going to endorse you next election. That means a majority of the Republicans in the Michigan Senate right now lose the Detroit Chamber's endorsement simply because of that act. And the plurality of members in the House who will be running for re-election or eligible to run for re-election. That signifies significant willingness to step into the arena that a lot of business groups haven't shown so far. And then you have a leading Michigan company like Dow, who's taken a position like that, not just in the state, but they're a national leader. And so there is a role that companies can play in changing the perception and forcing this change that's outside of the political realm.
It's fascinating to see these liberals, these Occupy Wall Street liberals now, speaking so highly of corporate America for taking such a principled stance. Look, we all know at the end of the day, these corporations, these businesses, it's all about the bottom line. It's all about profit. And so unfortunately, what I think we're seeing is some of them caving because they see this fake outrage on Twitter from all these Twitter warriors, right? And so sure, I will acknowledge that we are seeing some businesses react a certain strange way. However, they're doing it because they're bought. A lot of cases, they see this fake outrage on Twitter and they're like, oh, we better respond. And in reality, it's not there. And let's talk about the MLB All-Star Game. Who do we think that hurts when the MLB takes the All-Star Game out of Atlanta and puts it in Denver? The MLB is going to, the TV deals, the ratings, all of that, they're still getting that money. It's going to hurt the businesses around the Atlanta stadium in the area. And it hurts the working men and women of Atlanta. And it just because they're trying to appease this coastal liberal wokeness culture. And frankly, it's confusing to me to a certain degree. But what we saw with the MLB All-Star Game was absolutely ridiculous.
the MLB isn't the bad guy in this situation. And the fact of the matter is it's not performative art that these companies are doing. It's as simple as the fact it's right versus wrong. And the fact that you can't even understand that signifies a problem.
It's not right versus wrong. These are profit-driven corporations making the decision they think will, like, make them look best in the public eye. And unfortunately, there's a skewed
and they
view.
think the strong foundations of democracy are going to be good for their long-term business interests. And when
They're reading, the Delta. They're reading, and I love Delta Airlines, by the way. But they're reading. He read a letter that some corporate PR person put together. Please, the Coca-Cola CEO. We don't need to hear election integrity advice from the CEO of Coca-Cola. Please.
How about the CEO of Dow? You want to say anything bad about him?
I'm not saying anything about Coca-Cola is a great company. I love Diet Coke. I'm not saying anything bad about Coke or Delta or Dow. Dow's a great company, great Michigan.
How about Ford and GM? How about Blue Cross? How about the Detroit Chamber?
What do you? What? All right, you're.
I'm saying no. I'm saying because the party's also depending on these folks to fund.
I promise you, the Detroit Chamber is full of folks who supported President Trump.
So Emily, we are a capitalist country. Correct me if I'm mistaken. And my understanding is, yes, businesses tend to do things about what is good for their bottom line, but that also has to be with what do they think a majority of consumers
They're mistaken.
Is going to support. But Ted, I understand that maybe deep down you feel that, but where is
polling is showing us this. Look at the vice president and the president in recent days, right? And how they've responded, and it's changed because they did see the polling. Frankly, if you ask the American people straight up, do you support showing voter identification before, giving an example here, right? Voter identification before voting, a majority of voters support it, including a majority of African-American voters. So the polling is coming out and changing minds on this. But again, what we saw was reactionary woke culture. And I'm not a businessman. I didn't go to school for business, but I do think they're making a mistake. So let's not just start at the position of, oh, these are big corporations, so they know what they're doing. They're making the right decision, right?
I'm not saying that. I think what I'm saying is that often when we see big social change in this country, it happens sometimes once
because
this
Delta
level,
and Coca-Cola come out and take a strong position. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But
It is kind of interesting when I think of other times that businesses have sort of been on the leading edge of social change. It's more been to do with like practical like applications of their products. Like I think of the environmental stuff, for instance, and like, things like eliminating microplastics or telling their consumers, educating consumers about, what they're trying to do to be more environmentally friendly. And this is, fundamentally like, Ted was saying that he's not a businessman. Businessmen are not politicians. They're two entirely different fields. So I'm interested to see how this goes. And also, I think as the voting package moves through Michigan, maybe we'll get a better sense of which Michigan corporations specifically are going to step up on this. And then also, I just wanted to say that Ted,
Emily, question: what do you mean by step up on this?
Well, I mean,
Michigan Corporation step on? What do you mean?
Go from being silent to not being silent. I mean, take a position on this. That's what I meant. Also, Ted, I just wanted to say that you and I both love Diet Coke, so we should grab Diet Coke.
A National Beer Day. How dare you both? So we have a few minutes left, and what I do want to do is get back to the fundamental question of what we were all meant to be talking about, right? Which is the future of the Republican Party. Let's start with 2022. We will be in the middle of midterms. 4 years earlier, and that would have been 18. Right, when actually the person that might have been most helpful to Gretchen Whitmer winning Michigan could have been Donald Trump back in 18. He is not going to be obviously on the ballot in 22. What do you think, Jeff, of the non-presence, at least on the ballot, of Trump, although I think we can probably all assume that he will continue to be a factor and already is trying to continue to do that, right, with his endorsements and sending out statements. What does 22 look like to you without Trump on the national ballot? What does that mean for Michigan?
Well, it has the the possibility of looking a lot like 2018 when he wasn't on the ballot. The fact that he has remained the central organizing figure and face of the Republican Party means that he'll be on the ballot kind of implicitly in the same way he was in 2018. And I think that's one of the reasons why, I mean, here we are in April, and you have some generic polling that shows Whitmer could be vulnerable to a Republican, a generic Republican, but there's no serious Republican that has stepped forward so far. And we are well into the cycle. And when you look at history, we are well past the point where there would have been one or more people kind of moving forth at this point. And I think it's because there's uncertainty about what that future holds. When you look at the history of the party in the White House losing ground in the midterm, there are reasons to assume that could happen, and there are reasons to think why it might not happen this time. And Donald Trump is one of that. Is really the main reason why the Democrats and Biden could kind of buck that traditional cycle.
Mm-hmm. Ted, I want to look to you and what you see. Is there a fair point there that we don't necessarily see a leading Republican right now in Michigan in the gubernatorial race at this point in time?
Governor Whitmer is 100% beatable. We look at how she's handled this pandemic and the fact that we still now lead the nation in new COVID cases, and the way she's kept information from us, hasn't had an update in 19 days now. This governor is extremely vulnerable. We will have strong candidates emerge. It's not up to me or anyone else to decide who that person is. But
don't you kind of get to be in some of the rooms where it happens, though? Don't you want to give us a little bit of gossip about the conversations that are happening? You worked for John James once. Is he going to get in?
Right. Look, right now, my focus is on ensuring the truth about Governor Whitmer and the Democrats in Lansing is exposed, and the people and the voters of Michigan, it's put in front of them just the failed leadership across the board of these individuals, from their response to COVID to a whole host of other issues. Today's Democrat Party isn't my father's Democrat Party, and it's at the national level. We're seeing a dangerous lurch to the left, and even right here in Michigan. Governor Whitmer's failed response. It's not even partisan. Anyone watching this, think of the small business in your community that hasn't been able to weather this pandemic. It's not COVID that put them out of business and ruined their livelihoods. It's the government. And it's a governor who chose to go in alone from the start in order to raise her national profile. For her, it's all been about the political science and not the actual science when it comes to responding to this pandemic.
So those are obviously going to probably be some points that whenever a Republican does decide to jump in and put their name in statewide, that they'll be using. Emily, we're talking statewide, but one of the things that we haven't brought up that is going to be huge in Michigan, of course, is redistricting. That is happening both at the congressional level, right? And in all likelihood, Michigan will lose a congressional seat. This is an issues and ale that I'm really going to want to have once we get census and population numbers. Is a big, that was like the most NPR sentence I've ever heard someone say, but we will do an issues and ale on that. But I guess one of the things for you particularly in your coverage and what your bylines are going to be, stories are going to be under for the next 18 months, how different do you think the Michigan legislature could look with an independent redistricting commission drawing these new lines? And might we see some different power shifts in the state come 22?
Yeah, for me, it's too early to say, but I do have the feeling that this is going to be one of those kind of seismic political shifts that people are tying other things back to and realizing was sort of a fault line for a lot of things. I think of, like term limits as a seismic shift. A lot of people, are still talking about how those have changed Lansing and what they mean going forward. I think that this is that level of issue where it's going to be, a big deal. And I do think that, in terms of candidates, obviously the Republicans are, still waiting for that gubernatorial candidate statewide, although there are several people who have their names in the hat in the ring right now. But in terms of those congressional districts, I think that candidates who might be eyeing them are sort of eyeing them saying, what district will I be in? So I do think that the races might be a little delayed, or we might not see people laying as serious of groundwork as they might be if they knew where they'd land and where that line would fall.
And the overall climate, I want to go back to that. Ted had, his take on Governor Whitmer and being vulnerable. And I mentioned that in some polls, she's vulnerable to a generic Republican. One thing that has surprised me through this last year is how public perception has not followed the rhetoric of people inside of politics who watch this, and her popularity, her favorability on the handling of COVID, her job approval has remained surprisingly steady and strong. And I would not have expected that. I am surprised by it, and that bodes. That also has a kind of a chilling effect on the kind of candidate that they're going to get, and it's a fact. I mean, the polling, your internal polling shows it, and the public polling.
It's not. She's trending down. She is trending down, and trust me, the fact that Michigan now leads the country in new cases, and it's not a laughing matter, but the fact that the state now leads the country in new cases, these numbers they're going to continue to trend down. And Jeff, you know this more than I do. You've been doing this longer. Trends matter.
That is a very true statement. I think all of us who cover politics, we do know that when you look at polls, you don't look at just one simple poll. So Ted, you got to figure out which you believe, because you just brought up just one poll and now you're saying trends matter. And so let's keep an eye out for a few more polls.
No, she's trending downwards, and she has been for quite some time, and you're going to see it continue. She has a high favorability because frankly, she gets somewhat of a free pass in some corners in Michigan. And I'm not talking about Emily. We have some great reporters, by the way. I'm not referring to Emily or anybody on this program. But she gets a free pass a little bit. Jeff, first of all, are you still a Republican?
I call myself an independent now.
You're not a Republican. But would you still agree? Democrats often get treated better in the media as a whole than Republican elected officials.
That's
agree with that? Yes or no?
That's not why she remains popular. The reason she's remained popular is because more people agree with what she's done than agree with what the Republican Party hasn't done.
So I want to very quickly jump forward 2 years from now before we end. And I think one of the things that I'm really noticing, and this is just an interesting dichotomy to be in this seat, because one of the things that I get, right, is all of the updates on chat, where it seems like there's a few folks who are just, you guys are just frustrated with one another and going at it. And then there's a lot of questions that I have here. We have over, we have over 60 questions that we weren't able to get to.
I have one.
Ted, give me just a quick second. So one of the things that I really find fascinating is overall, there seems to be this frustration about, frustration in politics and anger about the anger in politics. And it feels like we keep getting to this sort of boiling point, right, in American politics. And it boiled over on January 6th. And now maybe it's back down a little bit of a simmer. And what I can't reconcile is this one side of what feels like this America that wants to take everything down a level, right? And try to treat each other with some kindness and just bring the tweets and the canceling everybody if you disagree with them down a little bit and be kind with one another, versus what I'm seeing also this real-time chat of name calling and yelling back and forth. Emily, how do we move forward if we can? Because it doesn't seem like these two things of wanting to get along is gonna work itself out in the next little while.
I think that we have historic evidence that working together across the aisle is productive. I look at the things that have passed on a bipartisan basis during this pandemic, even, in the beginning, working together, Republicans and Gretchen Whitmer, to get the funding where it needed to go quickly. At the very beginning of the pandemic, of course, there's a slightly different story with that going on currently. But, I do think that in my time in Lansing, I think that the most interesting, in-depth, serious changes that have come about have been bipartisan on some level. So I hope that there's not a disincentive for people to work together around some of this. I look at things like the auto insurance changes that was a huge thing to pass through the Michigan legislature a couple years ago now. And, it took both parties coming together to get that over the hump. Although, obviously much credit to House Speaker Lee Chatfield, or former House Speaker Lee Chatfield. But, I do think that to effect real systemic policy changes and cultural changes, that the parties do have to talk to each other. And unfortunately, I don't have a magic wand. That's the best starting point I have. It's certainly not a magic silver bullet or a finishing point. So sorry.
Ted, I want to give you the opportunity. We've talked a lot about the future of the Republican Party, and there's a lot of curiosity among the last of the questions and some of the comments. Where is there some middle ground that you think you could find with Republicans who currently believe that they're Republicans, but can't necessarily get behind the Trump wing of the party? Where could there be some policy middle ground there?
Look, any number of things. President Trump effectuated a conservative agenda and was more successful than maybe any Republican president in recent memory, right? When it comes to ensuring conservative judges are on the federal bench. Of course, the Supreme Court picks, promoting school choice, being pro-life, preserving our role on the international stage, but not getting ourselves into endless wars. Any number of things President Trump was successful at doing. And so, again, we've talked about it. Some folks may not love his style, but point to what he was able to accomplish in 4 years. And look, Zoe, you asked the question about playing nice and getting together and all this sort of thing. That's great and all, but I don't think that's we're focusing on the wrong question. This is national politics, right? We're talking about people's livelihoods. People's way of life. So it's going to get, when people are frustrated like they are in this country, which is why President Trump won in the first place in 2016. We can't expect people to play nice when they feel they've been sold a bill of goods for decades by both parties. And so really, I think in some respects, we're missing the Trump thing in that he won in 2016 because folks are fed up with both the right and the left, at least the political establishment in Washington. And so moving forward, going back to your question, the Republican Party's never been stronger. Our message of economic opportunity, national security, strong families, strong communities, that resonates, frankly, with all Americans. And so we expect to see big results coming out of this pandemic in 2022.
Jeff, come 2024, you said that you identify now as an independent. Who, for those folks, and there's quite a few who have been chatting and leaving comments that they still consider themselves Republicans, but feel like the party in some ways has left them. Leave Republicans some names or some ideals and ideas that you think in 2024 Republicans like yourself or your former self can get behind, and that we may actually see come 3 years from now?
I guess I'm a bit more cynical about the future. I mean, Donald Trump is the presumptive nominee again in 2024, unless or until he takes himself out of consideration. And so the next 4 years and the next election look, as divisive and as polarizing in terms of the body politic as the last four did in the last election was. Most Americans live their lives between the 35-yard lines. That's where the views fall. And, our politics, I've spent my decades in politics trying to keep the ball on our side of the 50-yard line, our side being the center right. When politics—
Not the last few years, Jeff, not with the Lincoln Project.
Now that's where I'm trying to— And when in the
Lincoln
center
Project,
right,
you
the
are
center
not,
right is-
you are not supporting
Ted.
no.
That's the
No, I
center right
have
is
to,
a viable option right now,
I
'cause
have
there
to
isn't one.
ask Jeff about the Lincoln Project. You were not helping support Republicans. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I've been good.
No, I wasn't trying to help Republicans because what I was saying, when the ball's between the 35-yard lines, that's where that's where the overwhelming majority of Americans are. The overwhelming majority of Republicans have been there for years, but the party's now operating in the red zone. They're far outside the norm, the mainstream. It's when people like Mitt Romney are the extremists in the party, and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Meshawn Maddock are the mainstream. That shows you where the party has changed.
God bless Mitt Romney. He should have been president in 2012, and the only reason he's not is because somehow he let the left and the Democrats paint his success as somehow of negative quality, right? That's where President Trump, he didn't apologize for being successful, making a lot of money in life. Mitt Romney, that ended up being a negative. Sorry, I just want to make that point. God bless Mitt Romney. Love the Romney family, Michigan people. But he didn't win because he somehow his success and personal that was turned into a negative. Sorry, I just wanted to point that out.
Ted, I'm trying to bring it back to some kind of unity here, man. Work with me here.
No, I'm really enjoying this, but I just want Jeff. Let's be honest about what the Lincoln Project did. I mean, made a lot of money for a number of folks by bamboozling Democrats, by raising a lot of money from Democrats.
Beating Donald Trump took a broad coalition, and it was very successful.
Well, we're going to leave it at that because the fact is Joe Biden is president. Donald Trump didn't win re-election. Was reading a story just today. I know it's not new that Donald Trump is now asking the Republican Party, in fact, not to use his name or likeness for fundraising. So one of the questions that we didn't get to, obviously, was, is there going to necessarily be a split and a so-called Patriot Party? So we're going to have to leave it at that.
President Trump said no. He's no intention of leaving the Republican Party. So we just answered it.
But he doesn't want to let the Republican Party use a former Republican president's name or likeness in fundraising.
What? That's obviously a much more complicated issue than just saying, yeah, it's not. And Jeff knows this. Come on, Jeff.
Okay. On that note, Jeff Timmer. Thank you very much, Jeff Timmer, who was a executive director of the Michigan Republican Party years ago. Ted Goodman, who is the communications director and sat in on our request for a voice from the current Michigan Republican Party. So thank you for being that voice today, Ted.
I hope to get invited back. I don't know.
And Emily Lawler, the one and only. Check her out on Twitter for all things coming out of Lansing. And Emily, maybe this is a good enticement if I ask that you'll put that nursing home report that MLive did on Twitter coming up so that folks can read it, because that's one of the things that we talked about.
Also the one and only one who brought an ale to Issues and Ale. So
and we will be sending all of our panelists a Issues and Ale pint glass, which you can get at michiganradio.org for those folks. And I want to say, everyone watching, thank you for submitting your questions. I miss seeing so many of you in person when you are all able to ask your own questions. So thank you for allowing me to try to ask them for all of you. And I look forward to the next time that we're all together. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, for tuning into Michigan Radio tomorrow morning. Okay, everyone. Have a good rest of your evening. Bye.
You're clear.
Are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, I was saying bye to Emily, but I think she's off.
oh, sorry, I'm on. Hi.